The African American Legend series highlights the accomplishments blacks in various politics, sports, aviation, business, literature, education, and religion. We'll explore how African Americans have succeeded in areas where they were previously excluded because of segregation, racism, and lack of opportunity. I'm your host, Dr. Roscoe C. Brown, Jr., and with us today is Chester Higgins, Jr., famed photographer and author of Echo of the Spirit. Hi, Chester. Glad to have you with us today.
Hi. Thank you. So happy to be here.
Now, tell us, your book, Echo of the Spirit, talks about your journey as a photographer. First of all, how did you get into photography?
Well, when I was at Tuskegee, I remembered our fellow college alumni here. I was introduced to this old photographer, P.H. Polk. And I went to his house, and he was doing some prints, developing some prints for me. And I noticed behind the wall there was a curtain, and behind these curtains were these old photographs that looked like they were from the 30s of farmers, but very dignified people. And it reminded me of my great aunt and my great uncle, people who I loved more than my parents in their 70s. And I realized I'd never seen a photograph of them. You know, in homes in the South, in Alabama, you will see these things on a wall about Jesus Christ, or biblical things or scripture, but no one had photographs because it was a very expensive thing to do. And I didn't have the money to hire this man to go 100 miles south to my little village of 800 people to make pictures. I asked him, I said, look, this is what I'm feeling. Would you teach me? So he gave me enough lessons in photography and a camera to get me going, and wanted to get my own camera. And I had disastrous results of trying to process my film and stuff. But a year or so later, I upgraded to a better camera, and then I went home and I started to make pictures. So the reason I picked up the camera was from the heart, wanting to make a photograph of people who I loved and deliver that photograph to them, so that they could, you know, this could be a part of their wall, a picture of themselves.
Your work is absolutely beautiful in terms of the perspective you get of individuals.
Thank you.
Having been a subject of one of yours,
Thank you.
I know the care that you take. Now, is that something that you can learn, or is that something that's just in the heart?
Well, I think it's a combination. I think that one of the things that I learned a great deal from this man, P.H. Polk, by going to visit him and just looking at hundreds of prints and asking him what was this situation, how did he do that, he sort of demystified the process of photography, but he really also showed how important it was a personal relationship. And that it's a personal visit. It's like a visit to someone. And you're asking about their life, you're talking about their life. And the more you actually know about someone, the better that picture is going to be. I remember years later listening to Karshav Ottawa give a lecture at ICP, and he was saying that before he photographs writers, he will read books that they've written. Before he photographs musicians, he will listen to their music, because this informs his professionalism and that layer of personalization, so that what he then will produce will have that many more layers to it. So that essentially, if you deconstruct that person, that image, you will find out that it has all these many layers. Because I'm trying to make not only a true likeness, but I'm trying, as I say, what's most important to me in my work is trying to capture what I call the signature of the Spirit. That we all exist at the pleasure of the Spirit, and the Spirit is in everything. And how one looks is only the beginning for me, because then I try to essentially dive inside, and so therefore show both of those things, what's in front and what's behind.
What about the receptivity of the person you're photographing to your interaction? How do you break through people who are really kind of rigid about it?
Well, I do it by talking to them. I try to de-emphasize the act of making a picture. I try to create a relationship where I'm a friend who happens to have a camera, rather than I'm a photographer and be on guard. So most people will probably say after a photo session with me that they probably didn't realize when I was making pictures, or when they did see me making pictures, they were involved in the conversation that it didn't register as much as it would have.
Well, the the world famous Gordon Parks was a friend of yours
A
and mine.
mentor, yes,
Uh,
friend.
Gordon's view of the world was a little different. He wanted to get the external part of the interaction of what's going on, and he did a lot of traveling like you. Uh, how does your work differ from Gordon Parks's work, and how is it similar?
Well, I think it's, first of all, it's similar in the sense that we're trying to broaden the visual equation or approach of how you see people of African descent. And that's by making sure that we include those three missing elements that too often are missing, and that's the issues of decency, dignity, and virtuous character. But Gordon was also more involved with, at another phase of trying to show, give voice to a certain level of cause for anger of African Americans, and also the period of militancy. My work is more, it's in a whole nother direction. Mine is really trying to show all of us what is of value that we should care about, and give us a different perspective, not only for our neighbors to look at, but for us to look at, because you are what you consume. So I thank Gordon in the sense that he made it possible for me to be able to do what I do, because what he did was a necessary thing that had to be done. I like to think as a second generation that now I can go and look at it from other different perspectives. Gordon also did a great deal of work, with fashion and in Europe. But I'm the one who really sort of became a Pan-Africanist with my camera.
Yeah.
So that's taking it another step down.
Of course,
Gordon did work in South America, in Brazil.
that'll be exciting. Now, one of the things that's happened over time is the technology of photography has changed.
Absolutely.
From the old days where you spent time in the bin and developing and so on, those days are basically gone.
Which I was not ever good at.
What'd you say?
I was never good at
But
that.
how did you make this transition to this new technology?
Well, I must admit it was slow at first, because I resisted the digital because I was so much in love with the quality that you get from the negative. And in fact, it took time for the digital to reach a point that its resolutions were so good that I was satisfied with, and then I made that change for several reasons. One, the quality improved. Of course, being a person who's very much involved, who's very concerned about light, I say light is my mistress. The one drawback about digital had always been, and it's getting better, is that it produces a flat sort of image. You don't get the gradation of light the way you get it in film. But for one who would go and spend a month or 6 weeks at a time in different parts of the world, different parts of Africa shooting, back in the old days, you had to try to convince the security people not to put your film in these X-ray machines. And one year I was making a trip, I combined 2 trips in Ethiopia and Egypt, and I couldn't convince, I lost that fight, and my film, when it was processed, had all these little fine spots in it. So at that point, I started using digital and film. I would shoot both. And then I would back up my digitals, and eventually, after a few years later, digital improved so much that I just started shooting digital, unless I want to do something particular like panoramic or double exposures.
What about lighting? How does the lighting effect change when you go from film to digital?
Well, the lighting, I think, is richer in film than digital. And why lighting is so important to me, lighting is the modifier of the image, because it determines the mood of the image. It determines the time of day of what you're looking at. It's that information that gives you mood is based upon light. So that for me, when I tend to shoot outdoors for my personal projects, like in this book, Ancient Nubia, I tend to like the light from sunrise to maybe an hour and a half after sunrise. And then I wait, and then I start again an hour and a half before sunset. Because that light to me is a more wraparound light. It works better for sculpture if you're doing it if you're shooting even in studio. So it's a low light as opposed to a very intense light. And I want that wraparound effect because in the book I did here in Ancient Nubia, you're looking at the antiquity sites, which could be temples or tombs or pyramids, and it's all stone. And in black and white sometimes could make it work, but then you have to make the sky red to knock out the black and white. But when color, you can sort of use that early morning, that golden light in the morning and afternoon to sort of wrap around it, make it warmer and make it lush. And then it just sort of makes someone appreciate it and even want to be there, hopefully. So light is very important. I say next to the subject, light is the most important thing.
Now, in terms of, that's what I was going to ask, in terms of teaching someone advanced photography, what would be the things you emphasize most?
Well, in addition to, and I talk about this on my website, chesterhiggins.com, that's a whole 4,000-page essay on shooting I call Reflections. In addition, the first thing is to know, to have some idea what it is that what reason are you picking up this camera? For what do you want to do with it? And for if someone had to look at something that you made from this camera, what would you want them to walk away from? And then once you come to an understanding of that, then you get into the particulars of photography, which deals with subject matter, composition, design, balance, positive, negative space, lighting. But all of those things are things that come into play after you've decided what's important to focus. And people sometimes say, well, what sort of camera should I get? And I tell them what my first mentor, P.H. Polk, told me, that no camera, no lens can make a picture. Only your eye can make a picture. And as Gordon Parks would say, only your eye connected to your heart will make the picture that's worthwhile. So if people can find out a way to, when they approach their subject, that they can do the Gordon Parks, connecting the eye to the heart, and then add the Chester Higgins on it, connecting the spirit to the eye and the heart, then I think you're going to make a great picture.
And the next thing is practice. You got to
Practice. You have to practice. Not only do you have to practice, but you have to have a discipline about the practice. You have to, and you have to have discipline about being able to criticize yourself as well. The easiest thing to do is make pictures and say I'm in love with it because I made it. It may not be a great picture. So you have to make a lot of different pictures of a lot of different subjects, a lot of different situations, and then look at them together and be very cruel and by deciding which one is really a picture that stands out among all of them.
The lesson for young people is that photography involves discipline as much as science, as much as art, as much as finance.
Right.
And the best way to get discipline is to work.
Right.
Over and over and over again.
There's no excuse, there's no shortcut to the work. You have to work it, but then hopefully as you're working it becomes a thing of joy, you know, so it becomes the best work is when you don't feel like that you've worked. You've done an awful lot, but it didn't seem like work because it's your passion. It's what turns you on. It's what gives you and in photography, it offers the opportunity of focus because it's a way to explore the world, and I say that a photograph never lies about the photographer because your interpretation of the world, the lens by which you see the world, is only as good as it has to bounce off of your own experiences as a person. That many different experiences that you've had since childhood, since your crisis, as well as the high points as well as the low points. And all of those things inform who you are. And that informs how you see things. And that is what I say is revelatory in anybody's photograph. If you're photographing people, I tell people, please, the first thing you have to do is drop judgments. Do not waste your time judging what's in front of you. Your job is to try to understand it and to accept it. If I thought judging would change things, then maybe that's something else. But the only thing judging will do is give you heart trouble. So let it go. Learn how to accept it. Learn how to see what it's all about.
Now, Ancient Nubia has this beautiful cover. You've shot it.
Yes.
First of all, how did you get interested in this? And then how did you go about actually doing the photographs in this wonderful book?
Well, my interest in ancient Nubia comes from my interest in African culture. I'm in love with African culture. In 1973, I made my first trip to Egypt, one end of the Nile, and I made my first trip to Ethiopia at the other end of the Nile, and I photographed His Majesty Haile Selassie that year. I kept going back and forth between these two places, the interior of Africa, that Ethiopia represents, and the apex of African culture, what Egypt represents. And in studying Egyptology all of this time, because you go there for the first time and you look at these monuments, and even though you're looking at remnants of things left behind, you're left with awe, like, what could have...
How did this happen?
How did this happen? Who were these people? What is this about? And what does this language say? You know, and what is the mindset of the people? And what will make them do these things? So I had to start studying Egyptology. And for a while, I guess the first few years, I was able to study the things that are available to us in bookstores. But then as my studying became more specific, I had to start investing in what I call rare book dealers because so many of the books that you needed were small publications and were not available. But then the other part of me, as I began to look at this, I was really confounded with the idea that Egyptologists they don't understand Africa. The line sort of stops at the southern border. It was a long time before Egyptologists would admit that Egypt was attached to Africa. And then the Africanists would not go past Ethiopia. They were like, you know, somehow this was over their head. They couldn't deal with it. And the border in between these two is Nubia. So what I was looking for is, and Nubia is quite different than both of these. It is a change. And I started looking at this, I think I made my first trip to Nubia in 2000. Trying to see exactly what this whole thing looks like, what it's about, what does it mean, and how it fits within this necklace of the Nile River, and this necklace also of African history. And I found it to be astounding for a lot of reasons. First of all of the feminists in your audience will probably be amazed to know that most of the rulers in Nubia were queens.
Right.
They were called Kandake. That is in the Meroitic term, Kandake, which in the Bible got corrupted to Candace. You hear the word in Kings 10 chapter, 1 Kings 10 chapter about Candace, Queen of Sheba. Well, that's a corruption of the word Kandake. And Queen of Sheba was the summer palace in Yemen that was part of the Ethiopian Empire as opposed to Queen of the Aksumite Empire. So you see these huge stone structures with these striding, huge women who are queens. And some of them may be matching with their sons or their king, but in the Nubian feeling, this is a matrilineal society. And the only society you have now left in African culture like that is the Ashantis. This is a matrilineal society where a part of the Kushite mindset was the woman was the head. She was symbolized as the cow Hathor who gave birth to the bull, which would be whoever she chooses to rule. It's kind of like the emperor having a prime minister. And not to confuse you, this is a feeling that East Africans have always had about religion, is that the night sky was heaven, and the night sky was a body of an African woman. And the Egyptians epitomized this in an illustration called Nut, where you see this image of a black woman extending herself over the planet in a downward dog position. Her hands are in the west. It's not the north-south pose, it's the solar pose. Her hand is in the west, her feet is in the east. And it's supposed to symbolize that in the evening when the sun sets, it rises up into her mouth and she swallows it. And it goes through her black body. But because she has a dress with holes in it, the sun light sprinkles out in the night as stars. And in the morning, because her feet are planted on the eastern horizon, she gives birth to the sun again. It is the same theory of the Nubians. The Hathor, the cow, gives birth to the bull. Because all these people were looking at were their societies were theocratic, and they were very heavily based upon religion. So everything, the temple, which reflected the cosmos, where they were planted, all of these things had to do with seeing that nature, but but a lot of people, especially early missionaries, got it all wrong by saying that Africans did not have one God, many gods. That's not true. All of these people, all these African people, monotheistic. What it is that they saw God in a holistic perspective. So that everything that exists is a part and a manifestation of God. It's kind of like if you're going to the library and you go into a card catalog. Okay, so this represents this and this is this, and all of these things exist of themselves, but they are part of the one God. And then people talk about how these people worship the sun. Well, it's true. At sunrise and sunset, you did have your major prayer services as the sun rose. But people never believed that the sun was God. But what they did believe was that the sun, because God is invisible, they believed that the sun was merely the window unto the residence of the invisible God. So all of these things, it's a whole nother perspective.
Now, in terms of deciding what you would take pictures of, what you'd photograph, how did you make that decision in terms of telling the story you just told us?
Well, first of all, those are two different things. My first thing is to photograph everything that I knew was there, that was above ground or below ground, that was accessible, that had some sort of markings on it, or that was part of some structure of significance, because we're dealing with things that are almost destroyed. And because I had studied so much about what should be there from other books, I had prior knowledge about what I would be seeing in a lot of situations. So then, because of all this prior knowledge, this research, this discipline that you have to do, once I arrived, I didn't know what I'm looking at, because to make a good photograph of anything, the more you know about it, the better you can then tell that story. So first, I had the ability to do the research and know what was there. So that once I arrive on the ground and I actually see it for myself, I know what I'm looking at. I know what's important about which walls. I know what's important about what designs, what inscriptions. So then the effort is to try to use the sun, if I'm shooting in the daytime, to bring out the reliefs to make things work. Or at night, bring in lights. My first time I went with no lights. The second time I went with battery packs of lights that I used with a BBC film crew. And the third time I went with a whole set of studio lights with high rises that went up to about 20, 30 feet, that I could actually light structures with strobes. And then I was used as a backlight, the setting sun or the rising sun, to give me separation. But so I went in 3 trips, 3 different 6-week trips in between 2000 and 2006. I photographed everything that was visible. And knowing that, and did not know, I just wanted to create an archive, did not know exactly which one of those I'll be using, but I wanted to make sure that I had exhausted the subject matter, so that I did have this archive that I can work many different ways. And that archive was developing my overall look at my book I want to do on called Before Genesis.
Now, how did you integrate those? How did the authors integrate those into the book?
Well, because of my friend Dr. Bob Breyer, who's a mummy specialist, he knew of these Egyptologists who have been working for 4 years trying to do the definitive work on ancient Nubia. And he knew, because 2 of those trips to Nubia was with him, he knew that I had all this material, not only from on location, but the museums, that I had done the work, that I had paid the fees, that I had made the contacts and camped out and avoided cobras and vipers and scorpions and pulled this work together, so that when they had arrived at what chapters, all of what they were covering, they realized when he had connected us up that I had everything that they needed. So it was a matter of just going through my archive, and they used half the pictures they wanted to use, because they had to pay me. They could only afford
When you
so
started
much.
this, you didn't think about publishing it, or did you at one time want to publish it?
Oh yes, I started because it's a part of my project that I call the Before Genesis project, which is looking at the Nile River, antiquity sites up and down the Nile River that speaks to early human belief systems in a God. In the 5,000 to 10,000 BC, that belief systems, what we would call people who believe in nature, which I've separated these two belief systems. One I would call spirit world theology, and that started in Ethiopia and traveled downhill. People don't realize that Nile started here in Ethiopia and goes downhill to Egypt. So it went downhill into Kush, into Egypt. And in Egypt, it turned around and came back up as Messianic theology with the Old Testament, the Hebrews, New Testament, and Islam. And all of those things you see in Ethiopia now. So I wanted to follow that history, that migration. So this is what this whole thing has been about. Now, out of that, a lot of other things are possible, including this book. But that's really what I've been after. And I realize that at the end of it, I'll probably use less than 1% of the pictures that I've made to make my book, but I want to have everything. I want to have everything I can.
Obviously, this is a very exciting trip through civilization.
Yes.
And particularly for African people, it's very important for us to know our role in it.
Right.
Today on African American Legends, we've been talking with Chester Higgins, photographer, Egyptologist, student of the Nile.
Student of the Nile.
Glad to have you with us today, Chester.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.